You have been warned. Well, I was warned already when I heard that you all were putting off your discussion about what to do with an armed intruder. I don't know if that's wise. So thank you for having me here. And bringing greetings from the people of First United Methodist Church of Boulder. Before I was at Boulder, for 17 years, I was the pastor at Broadway United Methodist Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. Before that, for 11 and a half years, I was pastor at Broadway United Methodist Church in South Bend, Indiana. And before that, for 5.5 years, I was pastor at Broadway United Methodist Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. For 34 of my 35 years serving churches in Indiana, I served churches named Broadway. So it was weird to move to a church named First. I want to tell you just a little bit about the story of some of what I've learned across the years in my work. I've always been, until being in Boulder, I've always been in churches in low-income, low-wealth communities. Boulder, Colorado is not a low-income, low-wealth community, but all those other places I served had been, and that's a central part of the story. I came out of seminary, committed to working in low-income, low-wealth places, and being helpful, being useful, because there's nothing a low-income community needs more than a 25-year-old with 19 years of education. I really wanted to be helpful. I wanted to be useful. I wanted to do good, right? And I was at Broadway Church in Indianapolis. I was the associate pastor to run the neighborhood programs. It's a historic old congregation in Indianapolis. Big old building. I mean, you all know a little bit about big old buildings, right? And we had 9 kitchens, 27 bathrooms. Wow. I mean, big old building. It had been in the 1930s and 40s the largest congregation in Indiana, not the largest Methodist congregation, the largest congregation in Indiana. And then in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, white flight had happened. And as white folks left the community, and the community became overwhelmingly African American, a remnant of those white folks stayed there at that church and wanted to make a contribution. And I was there to help run the neighborhood programs. And I was excited about that. And I came in because when appointment time comes, so did I turn off the microphone? Hello? Switch. Let's try. Oh, yikes. So I came in and I was in charge of the summer program. It was the beginning of the summer and the summer program. And the summer program at our church was basketball for the boys and cheerleading for the girls. And very painfully, we changed it. We built each week around a spiritual principle. We started every day with devotions. We ended every day with devotions. We had art, drama, recreation, history, math, Bible study, poetry, violin lessons, 250 young people, 9 to 5 every day. Broke my arm, pat myself on the back. I felt so good about it. This was awesome. I loved what I was doing, the congregation loved what I was doing, the community liked it, the benefactors loved what we were doing. It was great. But the last 9 months I was there in 1991, I did 9 funerals for young men in the 4-block radius around our church, all of them under 25 years old. All of them had died by violence. All of them had been in the programming that the church had done. And here I was thinking I was doing such good work. I was making a difference. 9 young men in a 4-block radius in 9 months died. And it really kicked me hard. I didn't know what to do. And people would say to me, oh, but if you hadn't been doing this, it would have been even worse. And I said 2 things to that. The first is, even if you're right, this isn't good enough, right? And the second thing is, no, just not right. So I left there to go to Broadway Church in South Bend, Indiana, and I thought, I'm going to do this better. I'm going to do this right in this new place, in this low-income, low-wealth community. And we had a food pantry. It was a little church there. We had 40 people in church on Sunday morning, and the largest growth group in the congregation was single mothers with children, not a group with deep pockets, but we had a food pantry. And we got government surplus food, and when people came to the food pantry, we would have people fill out this form. It was a government form. And it said, how much is your income and how much are your expenses? So people would fill out the form and it would say, well, my income's $600 a month and my expenses are $1,200 a month. Well, we're a little church of 40 people. What can we do about that? Not much. So we come to Pentecost in 1992. And after church in that little church, we would have lunch every Sunday. And we would sit around and talk with each other at lunch. And we're sitting around, it's about a half an hour after church, and this woman says, you said that Peter, reading from the book of the prophet Joel in Acts, says that God's Spirit flows down on all people, young and old, women and men. And I thought, how good am I? I'm an excellent preacher. It's a half an hour later, and she remembers what I said. I'm really good at this. And I said, yes, that's true. And she said, so how come you don't treat people like that? Ooh. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, when people come to the food pantry, you ask people how poor they are. If you believe God's Spirit flow down on all people, young and old, women and men, how come you aren't asking that? Good question. So the very next day, we started asking 10 pages of questions of people who came to our food pantry. 10 pages of questions about their gifts. And I'm not talking about the gift surveys that churches fill out. I'm talking about, have you taken care of older folks? Have you taken care of children? Have you done it because they're members of their family? Because you've had a job somewhere? Because you're helping a neighbor out? Can you fix a toaster? Can you drive a car? Do you play a musical instrument? Do you sing? Have you cooked for more than 10 people? Have you cleaned up after more than 10 people? Can you do drywall? I mean, just everything you can imagine. We asked 3 questions at the end. What 3 things do you do well enough that you can teach somebody else how to do it? Because everybody has something they can teach. What 3 things would you like to learn that you don't already know? And who besides God and me is going with you along the way? Well, one of the first people who came to us was a little woman about this tall, and half block from the church named Riddell Almagier. And she told us she was a good cook. So we said, prove it. She said, what do you mean? We'll cook for the custodian, the secretary, and the pastor lunch on Friday. So she cooked for us, and it was great. So the leadership of the neighborhood organization was meeting somewhere. We said, don't meet somewhere else. Meet here at the church and let Adele cook for you. So she cooked for them. They loved it, paid her for it too. Over the next 9 months, she cooked for 3 organizations. The Studebaker Elementary PTA had a meeting and needed food. The Southeast Side Neighborhood Health Center had an open house. They needed food. And Memorial Hospital had a press conference in their neighborhood. They needed food. She provided it. They all loved it. Then the Chamber of Commerce called. We want to have an all-day meeting of our leadership program in your church building. Well, that day works. You can eat here. Well, since we're going to be there all day, we need to use your kitchen. We said, you can use our kitchen, but we would prefer you use our caterer. They said, okay. We took $20 and made her 1,000 business cards. They said, lunch, paid to catering, spunky Tex-Mex food. And she fed 70 of the business and civic leaders in the community. Through that, they passed out a business card to everybody there. Through that, she got connected to the Michigan Business Women's Association. And a year and a half later, she opened up Adelitas Fajitas at the corner of 8th and Harrison and Alcott. Now, if we had said to her when she showed up, tell us how poor you are. Tell us how needy you are. We would have all ended up poorer for it, and we you would have missed a lot of great food. I did, and I was thinking, this is what I believe. I don't have to change anything about my theology, about any of the ways I think about that. Why haven't I been doing this before? And I realized it was because all my practices were around scarcity. They were all around what was missing with people rather than what was present with people. Any of you familiar with the writer Flannery O'Connor's work? There's a novel she wrote called Wise Blood, and in that novel there's a character named Hazel Motes, and Hazel is a pastor in the Church of Christ without Jesus. Where the blind don't see, the deaf don't hear, and then that's dead stays that way. And I realized this is her critique of the church, but it was her critique of me. I mean, I thought I was doing these things rather than they were already true around me. And it was my job to stop being so blind to what was true all around me. The story from Alan Payne's book, Crime in the Loving Country, just reminded me of when we went to South Africa back in 2007. And when we were there, we were talking with a Methodist minister there, and he said, we had a joke in South Africa in the 80s. And I thought, what was funny in South Africa in the 80s? He said, there are two possible solutions to our crisis here. One is miraculous and one is realistic. One solution is that God will send down angels and sort us all out. That's the realistic solution. The miraculous one is that we will sit down and talk with our enemies. That's what they did. And I realized I was always giving up on the miraculous before it even had a chance to happen. That when I was asking people how poor, how needy they are, what was missing, I wasn't able to see the giftedness all around me in the lives of people. Now, in basic Christian theology and orthodoxy, we say we're all sinners, right? We're all broken. We all have brokenness. But we don't sit around all telling each other about how miserable we all are. We spend time talking about what we all have to offer and what we have to share with one another and give to one another. I just want to pause a moment and say, does this make sense? Dad told me you all were a talkative group. So I want you to let me know. Is there a question, a challenge? Does this make sense to you? What I'm saying? Do you follow this?
Yes, tell us more.
Yeah, please.
Well, we have Pastor Brian Holmes.
Yes, I know Brian. Yes.
Okay. So he actually married our daughter and officiated. So during that, he made a comment that Jesus was a happy guy. He loved to laugh. He loved to party. And so it goes with that thing as opposed to looking at things on the negative side, look at the bright side of what's available and what's so it doesn't work, that's fine.
You have to hold it in for about 2 seconds.
So, anyway, so my point is that
It's a miracle. He gave it a chance to have in John 15, in his last comment with the disciples, one of the things Jesus says is, I come that you may have joy, that my joy may be in you and your joy may be full. Absolutely. In John 10:10, it says, I came that you may have life abundant, right? This was referenced in the sermon this morning. You'll hear it a little bit, I think, at the later service if you didn't hear it to me earlier. And I think in John 6, there's the feeding of the 5,000, and at the end of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus tells the disciples to gather up the fragments. And remember, they gather up the fragments, and there's more than they started with. This kind of thing about what a party is like, right? what that joy is like. So yes, I absolutely agree. I think a lot of what I was doing in mission and ministry was miserable, was not fun. And we would brag about how bad things were for people. We passed out this many tons of food because people don't have enough to eat. Well, yes, but I mean, where was the joy in that besides for you? And we struggled with this. We thought about this. So, but from then on, I thought, well, if all my practices are around scarcity, that means I've got to change the way I look at things and do things. And again, please feel free to stop, to challenge, to push, whatever. But I went to, then I was sent back to Broadway Church in Indianapolis. And when I went, the summer program was the same as when I left it before. And it wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad thing. It was fine. It was okay. But it wasn't changing facts on the ground because we were paying attention to what was missing with people, what was wrong with people, rather than what people's gifts were. So I have a friend who talks about discernment by nausea. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. That's when you know something has to change and your stomach is churning and this isn't going to go well. I don't know how this is going to go. And we were doing the summer program. So I got together the summer program people and said, we're not going to do the summer program anymore. It was as if the apocalypse had come. This was the end of life as we knew. Oh no, what are we going to do? I have no idea, but we know what we're doing is built on the neediness of people rather than the giftedness of people. Let's try and figure that out. So what we ended up doing was instead of running a summer program that we paid some people to run and that we also had a lot of volunteers for from the church and from the community, we ended up paying young people who lived in our neighborhood to meet their neighbors. And we had them do three things. They would go and visit their neighbors and find out the gifts, talents, dreams, and passions in their neighbors. They would lay hands on them and bless them. And then they would connect them to other people who cared about the same thing. So if they found writers, they'd get the writers together. If they found people who liked technology, they'd get those people together. If they found people who liked trains, they'd get people who liked trains together. Cooks together, gardeners together. And they did things like this. We didn't know what we were doing. We just knew that we wanted to build something off of the giftedness of people around us. I want to tell you too. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
How did the neighbors respond to the kids coming? How did the neighbors respond to those questions? How did the
It's a miracle.
How did the neighbors respond? We wanted to know. So, well, in various ways. One was with suspicion.
Yeah.
So one of the things we did fairly early that we switched was we told the young people to first go to neighbors they knew. Right? And then after they went to the neighbors they knew, they said, who do you think we should go talk to next? Would you let them know we're coming? So they would do that. But yes, at first they were just wandering around. Yeah. That was interesting. Well, what are you doing? What are you really up to? You really want to know what we're good at? You really want to know what we're good at? Yes, we really want to know, but across the years that built up. Then after the second summer of doing that, and again, we had just made this up. This was built on what we believed, right? This giftedness of people around us. So I get a call from the Indiana State Department of Health. When you get a call from the State Department of Health, this is not a good thing. And they said, we want to talk with the young people who are visiting their neighbors this afternoon. Okay, well, why? We'll tell you when we get there.
Ooh.
Yeah, great.
Bring a warrant.
So they show up, and the young people are there, and they start out by saying, we've been investigating you all for the past 4 months. Yeah. Okay. What's next? And they said, our job is to make the people of this state healthier. And we haven't been doing a good job. And what you all are doing, you young people are doing, is actually making the people of your neighborhood healthier. Blood sugars are going down, blood pressures are going down, diabetes is going down. Yes.
So I've been reaching for a question that gets to this issue. You're leading, pastoring a church in a community, and you are trying to reach out to that community. So there's the health department saying, our job is to make this community healthier. So what is the job of the church in a community in that kind of relationship structure?
Well, let me just say first, I have no idea. And secondly, what I say is to try to pay attention. You know, I had run a food pantry for years before I had that experience up in South Bend. And I didn't realize that for years, I've been actually making people sicker. The food we passed out in the food pantry, we would get fruit cocktail and syrup. And the biggest problem in our community was diabetes, but we never even tried to figure it out. I just thought, well, giving people food is a good thing, even though a lot of what we did. So I think what happened, we had gone to the School of Public Health, and we said, we're a church. We know nothing about evaluation. All we know how to do is count how many people show up in church on Sunday and count the offering. So what we want to try to do is, can you all just pay attention to what we're doing and tell us whether it's actually making people healthier? Because we didn't know, because we don't know. So what is our job in that? I don't know. I think that what I came to thinking it was to bear witness to something that the rest of the world said wasn't there, which was giftedness. So that the rest of the world, so that the rest of the community, the city of Indianapolis could begin to see that among people they thought of as poor, as needy, as people who didn't have anything to offer, were amazing people who had things to offer, who would make Indianapolis a safer, better, healthier place. And actually, over the decades, that's what happened. The city of Indianapolis and the Central Indiana Community Foundation ended up hiring a lot of these young people from our neighborhood and working with young people and older people in other neighborhoods to get people paying attention to the giftedness. What should the church be doing? I don't know, but that was what we tried to do. Is that?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. You want the non-working microphone?
Turn it on.
Oh, yes? I'm not sure how this question fits into the question you're saying. I volunteer at a crisis ministry run by ABCC, which is Asheville Baldwin Community Christian Community Ministry. And a huge proportion of the people that we deal with are at the point of crisis right then. Not everybody is there in the sense that we've been in a crisis, but they have no food in the house. They need food. Or they're a homeless person. And last night someone stole all their stuff. How does
this fit into
that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Doing which sounds wonderful, but most of these folks that we deal with are at the point where giftedness is the last thing on their minds. They need something to put on. They need something to eat. They need some help getting their rent paid before they get evicted. How does
this fit?
Yeah, and I'm not trying to.
No. It's a good question.
But because that just what you talked about just made me feel real inadequate. And the things that we're able to offer people.
Well, I think a couple of things I would say to this. One is that I have done a really good job of convincing people that the only thing I was interested in was what they were missing, not what they had. And
I think your mic is.
Oh, no.
You have to hold it in for a couple seconds.
hello,
There it is.
hello.
More back.
There you go. That's right.
Hello. I have no idea that when I came to this class, I would have so much fun training microphones. But I would say that overwhelmingly when we are seeing people, yes, they are in crisis, but that doesn't mean they aren't gifted. Even in and in the midst of that crisis, just like that's true for all of us. I have a problem with my heart. I have tachycardia. Every once in a while, my heart beats at 300 beats to a minute. That's not a good thing. And when it does, I have to call an ambulance, and they inject this medicine into me that causes my heart to stop and then restart, or at least it always has. My congregation can't do anything with the thing that's wrong with me. They can only do something with what I have to offer. And if I was treated like only the thing that I had wrong with me was what defined me, I would be miserable. And I think what I had done for years when meeting with people about a utility bill or a rent that they were going to lose or anything, that was all I was focused on. I never paid attention to what they had. I still remember in the 1980s, I was at Broadway in Indianapolis, and this kid who, his name's Andre, he would be outside watching the older kids play football every day. He had a football helmet he would carry underneath his arm. He was much smaller than the other kids, and he would stand out there every day. And they'd never call on him to come in the game. And I thought, man, now that's hope. But one of the things was, Andre came to see me one day, and when I go talk to his mom because they were going to be evicted. And so I went and talked to her, and yes, they were going to be evicted, and this is the beginning of Holy Week, and they were going to be evicted at the end of Holy Week, and what could I do about this? And I tried to do some things, and everything I tried, it didn't work. And Andre came down that night in the Monday, Thursday service and said, my mom wants to see you. And I thought, oh, right, I'm going to go, and I have to tell her. Couldn't do anything here. And I went to their house, and the only light in the house was the light they had in the fire. The electricity was out, everything else was out of the place. And she said, I started to say, I'm sorry, I haven't been able to raise enough money to keep you from. And she said, no, that's why I asked Andre to get you. I asked Andre to get you because we realized that packing up everything, we have a bunch of clothes that don't fit us anymore. We thought you could use them to share with other people. And I was like, I didn't know this or expect this. Even in the midst of their worst moment, she was like thinking of other people. And one of the things it reminded me of is that needy people want the same thing that everybody wants, and that is to be needed. And so my experience was people would come to me, and even if I paid a bill or even if I gave money, people would still walk out like they came in, a little bit with their heads down. But if instead I said to people, which over the years we stopped using the survey I talked about with the food pantry, and instead we would talk to people and we would say, so tell us what your gifts are. That's what the next thing was. And we stopped doing that. Because like if you asked me what my gifts are, I might tell you I'm a good singer. Anybody who stands next to me in church would not tell me I'm a good singer. It's not because I'm lying. I'm not lying. It's just that I think this, right? So one of the things we started saying to people is, what do the people who know you and love you, what would they tell us about you that you do best? And then they would start telling us things that would be interesting, things we could use and build off of it. What I knew from those first years at working at Broadway in Indianapolis is the people in crisis were always in crisis. And I wasn't, I saw the crisis this week, but then next month it'd be the same thing again. And when I started treating the same people around their giftedness, it changed everything. They walked out with their heads held high, even if the bill wasn't paid. And sometimes it would get paid, but not in the same old way. I would say to somebody, oh, you say you make good cookies. Yes, that's your gift. Okay, well, make me 2 dozen cookies and we'll pay you for them. And then that person would bring them back if we ate them. And if they were really good cookies, then we would say, okay, so now make 6 dozen. We have a thing in the church. We'll pay you for those. But then also, you have a neighbor 2 blocks away. I don't know if you know her, Miss Jackson. And if you would go to Miss Jackson and carry her 2 dozen of these cookies, she has cancer and she doesn't have much taste. It's like killed her taste buds, but she really loves chocolate chip cookies. And if you would take her these cookies and give them to her and sit around and talk with her for a little bit, we'll pay you this much for doing that. And they loved it. And the only thing we said is, you can't tell Miss Jackson, but we put you up to this. You've got to go do this, because everybody wants to be needed. Everybody wants to make a contribution. When people do, even in the midst of crisis, good things happen. Yes.
What is the role of hope versus help? You can help someone, but you can give them hope. So what have you experienced that has taught you about that?
Do you all know who Marion Wright Edelman is?
Yeah.
She's the head of the Children's Defense Fund. I once read a speech of hers from back in the 90s that said, the best contraceptive is hope. And I thought, well, I've never heard that anywhere else. And that's really good. So what I would say to you about hope is, that's what we would say to people. Tell us what people say you're good at. And then we would say to people, how can we be a part of that? Instead of saying, how do we engage you with us? We said, how do we engage with what God is doing with you in your life? That was hopeful. And when people were hopeful, then better things happen, which is, I think, what the point of the State Department of Health was making, is that we did another experiment with what was formerly called, I don't know if you saw that this has changed, IUPUI is now no longer going to be called IUPUI. Is now it's just going to be called UI. But not just IU. Is the public health unit at IUPUI had come to us and talked to us about, they wanted to do an experiment, because African American women aged 25 to 35 were the ones whose babies were born with the lowest ACTAR scores. And so they said, and then I swear this is to answer your question. They said, we noticed that you've identified a lot of artists in your neighborhood. We would like to hire those artists to go do art in the homes of African American women aged 25 to 35 who are pregnant. And at the beginning, and so one of the reasons that the lower ACTAR scores is, I'm forgetting the name of this drug that our body produces when we're stressed. It begins with cortisol. So African American women aged 25 to 35 are the most stressed demographic in our country. And because I would have thought, when they were talking about who had lower ACTAR scores, I thought it was going to be teenagers. No. It's these women 25 to 35. So they said, we want the artists in the neighborhood to go to the homes of women in the neighborhood who are 25 to 35 and do art class in their home. And at the beginning of the class, they would swab the inside of their mouth and put the swab in a test tube. And then at the end of the class, they would swab it again. And their idea was to see if the cortisol levels went down. Right? So across time, they said, yes, the cortisol levels went down. And they said the reason is because they're doing art. And we thought that the reason was not because they were doing art, but because they were seeing their neighbors, people they knew, as the answer to this problem, which meant they were the answer to this problem. That was hope. They knew that there was an institution, IU, that there was an institution otherwise that said, we see people around here as people who have gifts to contribute to making their community a healthier, better place. And that's the kind of thing that engenders hope, I think. But it was a disagreement we had with the university. They said it was the art. We said it was no, it was they, and probably it's a little bit of both. So, I mean, again, we would see people all the time in the places I've been who come in crisis. And the thing we would say to them all the time is, tell us what your gifts are. And it was a lot better conversation. They thought all we were interested in was what was wrong with them. All we were interested in was what the crisis of the moment is. And we were saying, no, we are interested in who you are, with what the Spirit of God is doing in your heart and life, because we know and believe that you are gifted, and we believe it's a sin to waste that giftedness. But again, I all the time was looking at people as if they did have something to contribute. And it was a really hard thing for me to change my mind around in this way. Yes.
Where did you get the money for all of this? Was it, you started out with 40 people in a church, but you're coming up with all of these programs. We paid them to go in, we paid them for this, where are you getting the money?
Yeah. Well, part of it was we just reused money that we had used to use for, paying people to run the summer program. Now we pay young people. Right. It was not getting new money, it was reallocating the money we had. Though, the part that I didn't tell you about what the State Department of Health said when they came and met with the young people is, again, I told you, they said, what you're doing is actually making your community healthier. They ended by saying, we just got $250,000 from the Rockefeller Foundation, and we'd like to give it to you for your work next summer. To these young people. We didn't do this by applying for money. We didn't ask for money. They came and said that to us. By the way, just one other little part of that was we got funding to do our summer program, right? People from the church would donate, and people from other congregations would donate, and we would write to Lilly Endowment in Indianapolis, which facilitated all the funds for all the different organizations. And we had written to them in December of that year and told them we're going to run the summer program the same way we've been running. And now in May, we're saying, well, we're not going to run it that way anymore, but they had already decided they were going to give us money. Well, then they call and they say, we want to come and look at what you're doing. And the people in our program had. And they're like, oh my God, we are doing what we said we were doing. And I said, well, yes, but they're going to ask for the money back. If they don't like it, they just won't give us money next year. So the guy comes and he spends time with the young people that day in what we call the loaves and fishes room. It was a room about this size in our church. And the young people would gather every day after they met with their neighbors. And in Post-it notes, they would fill the walls with the gifts of their neighbors. And they had Post-it notes in the forms of arrows and large things. And they would put them up. And if people had similar gifts, they would put them together on the board. So then they knew to go and see them. So they have Mr. Smith from Lilly Endowment is there to look at them. And he says, well, I want to go out with some of the young people. And they say, well, we're going right now because somebody's expecting us to visit. So he goes with them. The first door that they go to, a woman who's expecting them, she answers the door, and her son had gone to school with Mr. Smith. And they go and visit, and they go around and visit the different people in the neighborhood. But when he comes back, he comes and meets with me and with the guy who's running this thing. And the guy who's running this thing says, Mr. Smith, I know this is a little different than what we wrote. And Mr. Smith said, Wayne, this isn't a little different. This is completely different than what you wrote. But I'm gonna go back and tell the endowment, we should be looking at things this way and thinking about funding things in this way and looking at it from this perspective. Because I've never seen anything like this, he says. So the next year in January, I got a call from the endowment. And he said, we're having a meeting to adjudicate these grants for next year. And we think we like what you're doing, but it's a little confusing to us. Would you come talk with us about it? Sure. So I go and we talk for about an hour. I think it's a fine conversation. I get up to leave and he says, just one more question. I said, what's that? He said, well, what if we gave you more money than what you asked for? And I said, well, you're going to have to be more specific than that. He said, well, what if we gave you 20,000 more than what you asked for? And I said, well, if you gave us 20,000 more, we'd probably do this and this and this and this. And he said, could you also do that? And I said, yes, we could probably do that as well. And he said, well, we'll get back with you. And 4 months later, they sent us 17,000 more than we'd asked for, which had not been our experience in the past. Well, I'm serious. That when we started paying attention to the giftedness around us, it changed everything. On our grant reports, on our grant requests, one of the things is what need is being addressed by this, or what is the biggest need in your neighborhood? And I would always write, the biggest need in our neighborhood is to be needed. And though that didn't give them a quick answer to that, you know what it gave them is an excuse to call and say, what do you all mean by this? And it would have the conversation. So across the years, I just got, the death of those 9 young men practically kicked the life out of me. I thought, here I am doing this good work. But in the end, what I had to do was to try and think, how can things happen that will really change the circumstances around? Do I have time for one more story or?
6 minutes.
Okay, yes. Here it is and then over here.
Okay, so I have it's almost material. So you probably thought about this, but you haven't discussed it. You know, our entire Christian church and faith is wired to do the giving, looking down upon, and being able to say that I've done something. Yes, we have all these mission things where we go and do something for somebody. How did we get there? How did our church, what is your thoughts? How did we end up there? And we're stuck there.
How did we end up there? I have a really short answer to that, and that is sin. I will tell you that the answer for me about why I did that was arrogance. You know, I thought I had the answers. I thought I knew. So.
Did this change the violence in the community?
Yes. Yes. I think so this is 30 years later. I don't think it ever got, I don't think in the whole 30 years since then there have been none. Since we changed the way we did the summer program. So yes, over here.
One of the areas that I think has always puzzled me is this idea of ecumenical, where you have different types of churches, and then interdenominational, just different faiths. So if you, your church went out and they talked to neighbors, they could be neighbors going to different churches, neighbors of different faiths.
Absolutely.
And getting those people to come together of common interest seems to me that would be a way of integrating people and having people talk. So to me, that's a very favorable thing. You know, people I think sometimes we talk about people of different sexual preferences or beliefs, whatever, you know, and so people are so isolated in their own little worlds. But if you get the people to talk of different beliefs and they become one people again. So I'm thinking this is a pretty good idea.
One of the things about that was we would have our interns from seminary and other things go and meet with these groups, like the people who were cooks or the people who were gardeners. And the seminary students would almost always say, okay, so what's the agenda? And we would say, no. They all love to cook. They're going to talk about their favorite recipes. They're going to talk about what ingredients they use for this or that. They're going to use what garden tools they use. They're going to do things like that. They're not going to be, what we want you to do, we would say to the interns, is go in and pay attention. Where's the energy? Where's the spirit moving in this moment? And then build on that. Come back and tell us, where did you see connection happening? Where did you see energy? Yes.
Before you end, could you tell us about the book you wrote?
Yes. So I wrote a book, which I have some copies up here. It's published by Erdman's. It's called Having Nothing, Possessing Everything. Finding Abundant Communities in Unexpected Places. So it tells some of the stories you heard here. The final story I wanted to tell you was, we ran a tutoring program for 30 years at Broadway Church in Indianapolis. Every year we ran the tutoring program, the graduation rate in our neighborhood got worse. It didn't get worse because of what we were doing. It got worse because that wasn't the issue, and that wasn't the problem, right? But we didn't even try to look, because all that any funder ever asked us is, how many volunteers do you have? How many young people do you have? Nobody asked, did it actually get better? I would get tutors from Broadway, from Meridian Street United Methodist Church, St. Luke's United Methodist Church, Harmony Methodist Church, United Way, Lilly Pharmaceutical. I never asked for tutors from the neighborhood because these people are poor, right? They're needy. So I have a friend, Diamond, who's a part of the church, and he comes to me and he says, so you gotta meet Maya. I said, why do I have to meet Maya? She does tutoring out of her house. She lives 3 blocks from the church. What do you mean? She does tutoring out of her house. During the summer, call her. So I call her. So she works at AT&T at nights. When she gets up at 11, young people from her block come to her house. I said, what do you tutor them? And she says, well, if they either phonics or sophocles. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, if they don't know how to read, we do phonics. If they do know how to read, we do sophocles. And then every Friday I have a barbecue in my backyard, and their families come over and they present what they've learned. Now, we should not be saying to her, hey, come tutor in our program. We should be saying to her, how can we be a part of what God is doing with you and these young people and stuff around you? So there's more to that story, but I think our time is.
Go ahead, tell me, and
Okay, so she lives 3.5 blocks from the church. She's 32 years old. She's lived in the community her whole life, and she's never set foot in our church. And how do I know that? Because we asked her to come on Sunday morning so we can celebrate this, and she comes and sits in the front row. So she says, I'm not going to get up in front of everybody and talk, but I will. You can say something about what's going on here, and I'll talk to people afterwards. They can come up to you and talk. So we have a regularly part of the liturgy at that place where we had this happen right before the last hymn. So she's sitting up there, and the chair of our church council gets up there and asks her to stand. She stands, but she's in the front row, right? And her back is to the congregation, and she says, and he describes what she's doing. And then he says to the congregation, will those of you who will support her with your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness, please stand? Well, now everybody's standing, but she doesn't know that because she's in the front row. So then he says, stealing from the marriage liturgy in the United Methodist Church, will all of you do everything in your power to uphold and care for this person in her ministry? If so, you answer, we will. And when they thunder, we will, this is what she does. And when she lands, 2 things that were invisible are now visible. We had not known there's people doing this remarkable holy work all around us. We thought of these people as needy. And she had not known there's a congregation full of people ready to support and encourage and bless what I do. So that's awesome. So thanks.
Amen.
Yeah.